Hi, I'm Brady Forrest. I run Highway1. Highway1 is a hardware accelerator, and so I'm here to talk about hardware. And the way I did this talk was I went to some of the 45 startups that I've worked with over the past 2 years and just asked them some questions, and I've aggregated their responses into this presentation. So first, just a little bit about me. I started off as an industrial engineer at RPI, ended up doing consumer internet at Microsoft. Then I went to O'Reilly Media, where I chaired a number of conferences and started Ignite. So has anyone here been to Ignite New York? No? All right. Well, that started with us. And then I went to Coastal Ventures for a hot second before I went to Highway1. And so Highway1 is a hardware accelerator in San Francisco. We give $50,000 to various hardware startups. We work with them for 4 months. We have engineers, and then we try and take them from prototype to product. So you may know Ringly. They're a local team. They're basically it's a Bluetooth LE ring that notifies you when your phone is ringing, when you get an important tweet or a text message. So when they came in, they had kind of something the size of this clicker maybe on your finger, and now it's shipping. And we also worked with Navdi. These two companies were both in our first class, and Navdi is a heads-up display for cars. So when they pitched me, their prototype was the size of a kitchen table. When they came to us, it was the size of a shoebox, and when they left, it was about this size, although without the exploded view. So to start this talk off, I wanted to just kind of dive in, similar to what Dan just did with Scout, and walk through a case study. So a company that I work with, not one that's gone through Highway1 though, is Orion. And Orion makes a push-to-talk communicator badge. It's basically like Star Trek, but using your iPhone or Android phone. And so that device on the right connects to your phone via Bluetooth, which then uses your data connection to connect to the network. And the idea is that instead of having these extra devices that construction workers or service workers would have to wear, you just have this badge and then it's bring your own data. So when they started out, they realized that they could get going with just 3 people. And so this is what they ended up seeing as their staging. So for proof of concept, it cost them about $10,000. To get to an actual prototype where it was a functional, I can carry this thing around, it doesn't have a battery pack the size of a shoebox, took them $10,000, or more like $100,000, 5 people in 2 to 5 months. But to actually get to production, it took them more like $1 million. And so they raised venture along those ways. So here's the actual breakdown of their burn. So when they first started out in May 2013, it was just $1,000. But then as they started outsourcing more, they weren't taking salaries, by the way, during this time, their burn steadily increased. And it seems like it's really going up, but it's actually only $20,000 to get this going. And this is what the team looked like at that time. A CEO, CTO, head of design, and then first engineer. And with them, they were able to make their initial product. And then after they had that prototype, they were able to go out and get funding. And then this is what their burn looked like as they went into production. Boom. It looks more like the Twitter growth graph than their previous burn. I mean, what they had going on before is just dwarfed by the cost of actually getting hardware into production. Now, they may not have been as scrappy as Scout in terms of getting this done, but the costs are about the same, and I'd be curious to know if the figures look approximately the same. So it took them about a year from their initial get-together to start moving into production. And this was the team at launch. At least 14 people, it's grown quite a bit, a lot of development on software. And so you could say that it was after those 3 months that they were ready for crowdfunding. However, they were concerned about knowing when they would actually reach here. And so they didn't want to dive into that. They were concerned about the hard part. So they didn't just go and do Kickstarter right away. Instead, they buckled down. They'd taken funding so that they didn't hurt their brand by being late by delivering their product. So they waited until they actually knew what they were going to make, how they would make it, and then they launched their crowdfunding. And this is what they did during that time. So, whereas the prototype was about getting a couple of Arduino boxes to talk to your iPhone and then communicate via AWS, this was more about figuring out what their BOM was like, so sourcing the electrical components. They had one really high-ticket item that they had to order really soon as they got funding. They had to actually make the PCBs. They had to do assembly. They had to source off-the-shelf software or hardware. And all of this was done in China from a team in San Francisco. So some very experienced people went and lived in China for quite a while this was all being done. And then at the end, of course, the product is put into packaging. So here's another way of looking at that initial graph. So you kind of survive on credit cards in the beginning, and then you can go to crowdfunding. Or what they did was they actually took the bottom path and got a syndicate together, had some angels put in money so that they wouldn't have angry customers. And then they went to VC after they had started shipping, or right before. So let's look at that core team that they had to have at the beginning of their product. And this is what I see for pretty much all of my startups, is these are the various disciplines that you need. And even if you don't have that specific discipline on the team, you need to have a champion on the team. So someone who owns this area, even if they're not the experts yet. Someone who reaches out, someone who manages the consultants and moves this area forward. I mean, the most obvious part is hardware. You need a mechanical engineer, you need an electrical engineer, and you need a firmware engineer. Mechanical is what builds your enclosures. It makes sure the product, functionally stays together. Your EE will build the boards. Your firmware expert writes the code that actually that lives on the boards and controls your battery consumption, your connections, gathering data from your sensors. Then you have your software team. These are the guys that are usually building the back end and your mobile app. Design, both UX and industrial design. You don't recommend to most of our teams that they have an ID person on staff at first. There's generally not enough work for what they're doing. But having a software UX expert can be considered. Someone to own the product, either program management or product development, but someone who's got their eye on bringing the product together in a cohesive manner. And finally, kind of biz dev and marketing. And generally, this is rolled into one person at the startup stage. When you're dealing with 1 to 3 people or up to 5 people, you're going to wear double hats here. And things like HR, that's more overhead. You're still kind of more of a project than a company at this point. And hopefully you're all on the same page. So if we look at the Orion original team, the CEO was running both project management and biz dev. The CTO was doing software. Their head of product was doing industrial design and marketing. That had been his background. And their first hire was an ace EE. And these people all worked on no salary for quite a while they were getting that proof of concept going. And this is kind of sort of according to Glassdoor, what the salaries will be for senior and junior people in these respective fields. I think there's a lot of press about software, not as much about engineering. And this actually seems a little low to me. I pay more than that for senior people in San Francisco. So from the startup, so I went to the startups, a number of them, and said, what was your hiring plan? How did you build out your teams? What were some of the takeaways? And one of the ones that resonated with me was this. The idea is don't start with deep experts unless they happen to be on the founding team, but instead find generalists so that you have people who are comfortable wearing multiple hats and won't get stressed at being outside of their wheelhouse. And so you can see from his kind of more in-depth instructions, this is the way he would build going forward. So he would find a more generalist EE firmware person, a full stack dev, one person to run design, but then work with the consultants, contract out ME, and then contract out the grunt labor of the electrical engineering work. So actually hire consultants to do the board design, but not the actual architecture. Now his product though is fairly simple mechanically, so he kind of had this luxury. I work with a cooking startup that's basically all mechanical, and so it would not be wise for them to pursue this path. So it really depends on the type of product you're making. In-house is best when there is full-time work. So this assumes, though, that you can get people to work for very little money if you are a startup and you're just getting started and you don't have funding. Now, one way this happens is people work nights and weekends, but that's not always sustainable. Another way that people do this is by vesting equity hourly. So you take people who you want to bring in-house, you start them off as kind of consultants, but they begin their vesting right away. One of my teams got a lot of work done on very little money doing it this way. They picked an hourly rate, they assigned a value to the equity, and they drew up contracts that did this vesting. Now that team, the two co-founders were biz dev and a double E generalist. And then their hires were more around the mechanical side and design. And I summed up this next one, which is your industrial design firm is more like a brand. And that's one of the reasons why I don't recommend that you bring industrial design into your startup. There's usually just not enough work for an industrial designer on your team. When you do an engagement with an industrial design firm, it usually only lasts 2 or 3 weeks. Hopefully you've already validated demand, you've done your customer trials, you've been working with clunky 3D printed, perhaps CNC'd enclosures, but to get to that final product, you want to work with someone who comes to it with fresh eyes, but also with an opinionated design, who knows how things get manufactured, and who can impart their specific taste on it. And that's what you see with brand names, kind of like with ammunition, or with Fuse Project's Yves Bahar, is they impart their own stamp on it, and that actually helps you make a mark in the market. It's like having another partner, but actually brand name to launch you. So in this case, the founding team was pretty rounded out. They had several Stanford graduates, and then they did contractors and worked with Ammunition Group to design their product. Now, kind of the next thing I'm going to dive into is just sort of investor questions that some of the startups faced along the way. These are all early stage startups in their first 6 months of life, trying to get some money, and these were the questions that they were faced with. So, how much do you need and where does it go? At this stage, this is something that you need to be thinking about. No one expects you to have all of these answers, or especially for these answers to be correct. But you can't expect people to just give you money if you can't explain what your budget is, what your milestones are, and what you're going to prove with their check, as well as how you're going to get enough money to get you where you're going if this check doesn't complete your round. The worst is, how do you get to $1 billion? I actually kind of disagree. If you want someone who's in the business of funding billion-dollar companies to give you money, you should have an answer for this. Again, nobody expects you to actually know your true roadmap, but you shouldn't just expect checks to come your way. But this is the question that I think really sums up the state of hardware today, which is, are you a software company or a hardware company? And I think that is the crux for most hardware companies these days, because VCs, investors, are used to software level returns, where there are network effects that bring on more and more users, and where they expect exponential growth. And when you're just selling a product, and you're just selling it one time and there's no software play, then they're not going to see the returns that they want or expect, and you won't get money. So the best of our companies come in as hardware companies with a plan to get to software. They view their hardware as a platform, and once there's 10,000, 20,000 of their units out there, then they start to do add-on services that either are gathering data or providing additional functionality. Shoot.
I have a quick question on that. Like, if you look at companies like GoPro 4 or 5 years ago, or like a JBL, or any of the Bluetooth speaker guys who are not really software related, they're pretty hardware, they're pretty successful, and not much software involved. So, if you're talking to an investor, what do you say?
Well, I think with Jawbone, you can see that a lot of their hardware has been commoditized over the years. So they started off with Bluetooth speakers, Bluetooth headsets, and then as other people went into that area, they then switched to speakers. They're now shifting away from that and going into more fitness hardware, which actually does have a data play. And if you look at Fitbit, they also have a data play. And GoPro, right before it went public, bought the firm that's been building their client software for quite a while. And they're trying to add in more hardware and software integration. So in the latest camera, it's got built-in Wi-Fi, and it's got a button. So as you're filming, you can press it. So I know the biggest problem I have with my GoPro is that after I get back from, say, scuba diving or whatever, is I have hours and hours of footage and not much use for it. And this button helps integrate the hardware and software experience so their software can learn what's interesting. So I don't think we know exactly what GoPro's going to do now.
Is GoPro a hardware company or software?
They're both. They're absolutely both. And the worst, why don't you just do a Kickstarter right now? In this case, it was a product for new moms. And so new moms generally need their product right away. And if you're a year out from production, then it doesn't make much sense to go to Kickstarter. But a lot of investors will want you to have tested this, but without the cash to actually let you test it appropriately. So what I recommend to startups is they put up maybe pre-sales on their site, but they don't do a full-blown Kickstarter. Or they go to Kickstarter and do a limited run, capped at, say, 30 or 40. Fishbit, Current Labs, one of my companies, launched a Kickstarter right before our demo day. They sold out their 30 units in 24 hours. They're going to deliver them this summer. They'll gather data from those users. They've been able to show it as a validation point. And then when they go to launch their full Kickstarter in September or October, they'll be able to show, okay, we've already been on Kickstarter. Our product is better. We have testimonials. We know when we're going to manufacture. Now let's blow this out. All while not sacrificing kind of where their company needs to be down the road. I'll be around for the rest of the night. As mentioned, our applications are open and we're looking for hardware startups. Any questions?
Before we jump into questions, I have to mention, because I will modestly not mention it, but you're about to be a published author, even more published. So you have a hard.
Yes.
And you're about, most importantly, to become a reality TV star.
Something along those lines. In June, an O'Reilly book entitled The Hardware Startup will be coming out, and I co-wrote that with Renee DeRestra from OETV and Ryan Vineyard, my lead engineer. And it basically kind of talks about prototyping stage, crowdfunding, accelerators, VC funding for hardware, certification, legal. 12 chapters that really kind of takes you soup to nuts from prototype to product. And then, yes, in September, I will be part of a show airing on Sci-Fi. Has anyone seen the Anthony Bourdain show, No Reservation, Parts Unknown? So that production company, 0.0 Productions and Sci-Fi, have been trailing three companies from Highway1 and 3 companies from 500 startups. And they've been filming us for 4 months now. And each episode is going to show how the product was made. So like the day one when Serenity, one of my companies, drove all night from Austin and then showed up with their cooking robot to what they graduate with in 2 weeks. So yeah, that'll be, I think it'll be, my hope is that it's good for, Highway1, the startups, but the industry, that it shows that technology isn't just made in Shark Tank, but that there are a lot of late nights and that there's progress, and it's not just that final moment when you get money from investors, but instead it's a lot of teamwork. So that's my hope with the show.
Very cool. So just a couple of questions. Who hasn't asked a question? Let's go, Chandler.
Earlier you mentioned cooking startup, now you're just naming them Serenity.
Yep.
I was fortunate to check out your guys' office last month actually, and I set up a really cool space. And Serenity and a couple other companies, what I'm doing now is they're kind of in your office. And I would love if you could just perhaps speak a little bit about Serenity, because they were one company that I was just really fascinated by.
Yeah, I mean, the idea is, who wants frozen meals? Instead, I'd rather order food from, say, a Blue Apron and then have it prepared for me when I want it. And so it's a heating element and a robotic arm. And I can say, I'd like this Thai curry, I'd like this ramen, I'd like these scrambled eggs. For me in about a half hour, and I don't want to deal with it. That's the idea to start.
Can you comment a little bit more on your business model? So you're taking the company from prototype to production, and then you're just copying there, or you have a stake in these companies, and how do your company make?
So we are part of PCH. PCH is a large manufacturing supply chain management company. They run Apple's supply chain, they run Littlebits, and they work with startups. So startups come into Highway1, and we help them get to the integrated prototype product, a fundable prototype. And for equity. So we give them $50,000. We work with them during the program. We retain an equity stake, and then some of the companies will go on to work with PCH. But that's neither a guarantee nor a requirement. So it is their choice if they want to work with PCH. And some do, and some don't. And we stay in touch with a lot of the companies. I just saw Christina from Ringley a couple weeks ago. I text with Doug from Navdi on a regular basis. I'm going to dinner with Modbot from our second class next week.
How much equity?
4 to 7%, depending on stage. If it's a priced round, then we just contribute.
All right, last question.
Will you do convertible debt?
We can talk, but generally no.
Okay.
All right, I'm going to be around after the...
Yeah,
All right.
I'll be around till 9, so come up and say hi.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Matt. This was awesome.